Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our viewers.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our viewers.
Jesper, I can hear myself. Should I close this chat? Yeah. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our viewers from around the world. Welcome to yet another BIMCO webinar. I'm pretty sure it has been raining webinars for a lot of our viewers, and it is the same to us here at BIMCO. We're either hosting webinars or speaking at other webinars or simply participating as viewers, just as you are doing today. I think it's a new normal and we've got to get used to it, at least for some more time. My name is Ashok Srinivasan. I work as a manager in the Maritime Safety and Security Department here at BIMCO, based in Copenhagen, Denmark. The subject we're going to discuss today is not quite a broad one. It is a niche topic, but not really small to those who have experienced this or, let me say, affected by this. That is the legal and security risks to ships of Singapore, Malaysia and Indonesia. To discuss that today, I have two leading experts in the field, both based in Singapore, who will give us some excellent insights into this subject. First one is Mr. Dughall Aitken. Dughall is the Chief Executive of Spica Group of Companies, including Spica Services, Boyd Marine Consultants, and Asia Maritime Claims Services. He has the overall management responsibility of the group's 22 offices throughout Southeast Asia. Spica Services are dedicated P&I correspondents representing the majority of international group of P&I clubs. Dughall has been closely involved in handling many of the region's highest profile casualties, including collisions, grounding, sinking, and pollutions. BMC is a marine survey consultancy based in Singapore, providing survey services to P&I clubs, hull and machinery, and marine and energy insurers, ship owners, and charterers. Recently established AMCS is a marine claims consultancy providing cost-effective local solutions to the marine liability market. Good afternoon, Dughall.
Afternoon, Ashok. Nice to be here.
Good afternoon. I also have Mr. Thomas Timlen, who is an analyst at Risk Intelligence, a leading maritime security company. I must say Thomas's association of BIMCO goes quite a long way, actually. He has been a BIMCO employee for a number of years, and he's helped to set up and run our Singapore office for quite a number of years. So on that note, good afternoon and a small welcome back, Thomas.
Thank you, Ashok. It's good to be back.
Great. Along with the three of us, there's also my colleague Jesper from the IT team, who's sitting in the background to ensure everything goes smooth. Going by the happenings in the last couple of weeks, one with Microsoft Teams and then with a couple of big names in maritime industry, you never know what happens. But should something go wrong, just stay back. We will get back as quickly as we can. Today's webinar will last around 45 minutes. We will start with a short introduction to BIMCO, a presentation on the topic at hand itself, which will be shared by both BIMCO and Risk Intelligence. And then we will move on to the main program of the day, and that is a panel discussion between the two expert speakers. This will then be followed by a question and answer session. Now, speaking of question and answer session, you will see on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a chat box where you would already see a welcome message from BIMCO. Please feel free to type in your questions and we will take them one by one during our Q&A session. Lastly, the webinar will also be recorded and shared again in our social media platforms. Therefore, should you wish to view it at a later stage, you're welcome to do so. Now, without further ado, let me go straight into the topic of today. You would be seeing a screen. Yes, you can see the presentation now. That's a quick agenda of today. Next slide, please. Great. And well, this is what BIMCO does generally. We would not be taking this slide in every of our webinars, but because this is an open webinar and it's a free webinar and we have audiences from outside BIMCO's membership and also those that are in the maritime industry and want to know more about BIMCO, here it is what we do. BIMCO is the world's largest international shipping organization. We have around 1,900 members. And when I say 1,900 members, there are 1,900 companies. We don't have any individual members. They're spread across more than 120 countries. Together, they represent 60% of world's merchant shipping fleet. And our members include ship owners, ship operators, ship managers, brokers, clubs, agents. And some of our products are, well, the contracts and clauses. If you are in the maritime industry, at some point in time, you might have come across either a BIMCO clause or contract. And that is our flagship product. We create a contract and clause for pretty much everything in shipping, right from when a ship is built up to when it goes to recycling yard. There is a contract or clause that covers most of it. The second one is maritime information. We have huge cargo databases, both wet and dry cargo. We have a huge information on ports, very minute information on each and every port. We also have a KPI system, a key performance indicator system, where companies can compare their business with the business of the outside, or compare their fleet of ships and see how they're doing in comparison with the industry in general, or if you want to just compare with a specific segment, you could do that as well. We also have quite a few regulatory and technical contents in there. The training department of ours, we conduct high-level training mainly on commercial matters, but our training department, they travel across the world and give training to various companies and also at important shipping hubs. We have a support and advice department, and we give support to pretty much anything our members require right from commercial to technical to even regulatory matters. And the last one, but not the least, is the regulatory department. And this is where I sit, where we have a voice of the ship owners to the International Maritime Organization. We also ensure that if there is a regulation that's coming up and that's not practical enough for ship owners, we try and ensure that we voice their concern to the relevant authorities. And it goes the same way the other way around. If there is something, a gap in the industry where it needs to be regulated, we do that as well on behalf of the ship owners. That is BIMCO in very quick words. Next slide, please, Jesper. Right, this is the three main topics that we're going to talk about today. One is the legal risk that I already mentioned that ships face, especially in Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia, the security risk that they face, and we've also heard about some heightened level of enforcement activities in Indonesia. We will talk about that as well. Next, please. Great. Risks to ships. Now, we all know that Malacca and Singapore Straits is one of the busiest traffic lanes in the world, and a lot of activities happen here. And because of that, and because of its geographical location, not only there exists a number of safety and navigational hazards, there's also some legal risk, and not to mention security that's present here. It should be noted that there are no international waters between Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. There is only territorial seas belonging to one of these states and straits used for international navigation. Now, as per the articles of the United Nations Convention of the Law of Sea, the presence of an international navigational strait does not in any respect affect the legal status of the waters forming such straits. And that means when a ship is transiting through these straits or through the territorial waters of one of these countries, they either have the right of transit passage or they have the right of what we call as an innocent passage in UNCLOS. What this means is that ships should generally proceed on their voyage continuously and expeditiously without stopping or anchoring, unless, of course, the navigation or safe navigation requires them to do so, or if there is a force majeure, or if the ship is in distress. But that also means that as soon as the ship slows down and starts to get involved in, let's say, an STS operation with another ship, or even interfaces with a small craft where it transfers person or goods, it loses its right of innocent passage. And again, as per UNCLOS, coastal states are allowed to adopt laws and regulations for the safety of navigation, the assets they have, such as pipelines, navigation aids, all those things, but also to prevent any infringement to customs, fiscal, and immigration laws of the country. Now, all these three littoral states, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, they have such laws protecting their waters that applies to all ships, including the merchant ships that transit. But whether these laws have been uniformly and strictly enforced at all times by all these three states, that's another matter of discussion. But it has come to our notice that some of the merchant ships have been intercepted by authorities, especially of Indonesia, and have them either detained, arrested, or penalized otherwise. This is what we're going to talk about in our panel discussion. Next one, Jesper. Right. When our members came to us requesting for advice, and this is what we could give them. This is sort of the general advice. You must have heard it already, but this is very, very general, that people should avoid doing operations in areas where only innocent and transit passengers are allowed. And if you are sort of operating in overlapping jurisdictions, then please check your positions and ensure which country you're actually in before you conduct those operations. And if you do, then have enough room so that you don't sort of get into the other territory. And in case you can't avoid that, then have specific permissions obtained from that country. Notify and get permissions from the appropriate authorities. Also, use the designated areas, designated anchorage areas or designated bunkering areas, whatever that has been designated, use those areas for that operation. And keep the AIS, the automatic identification system of the ship, switched on at all times while you're in these waters. Yeah, and with that, I'll hand over to Thomas for his small presentation. Thomas.
Thank you, Ashok. Next slide, please. Right, so just the title, next. Okay, in a very brief way, back, please. Okay, I'll briefly describe risk intelligence because we want to get into the subject matter. We'll look at the 8 threats that we monitor in the area, and then I'll take a closer look at the specific topic of the anchorage issues. Next. So from our website, please, you'll get more details, riskintelligence.eu. So as I said, I'm going to go briefly through this. If you have more questions about the company, this is the place to go. Next. Okay, starting with the free stuff. Amongst other things, we produce white papers. They're available to everyone free of charge. Our most recent one is about the coronavirus and the impact on maritime security, including crew change. And if you pick up this, or if you download this PDF, you'll also get a brief summary of different security concerns in different parts of the world. You might say an executive summary. Next. Okay, then there's the products that we sell, and one of them is the monthly intelligence report. This, in every issue, covers the regions of West Africa, the Western Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia. And in addition to that, those regular features, we also have a feature article. And in the most recent edition, we look at the current developments in the Mediterranean. Many of you will recall the conflict between, well, conflict, fortunately, it didn't get that far, but the issues between Greece and Turkey. So we have a look at that and see what it means for maritime operations. Next. Then we also have bespoke products, and just one example. We produce voyage risk assessments for a specific vessel in a specific voyage and at a specific time. Because all of those factors will change depending on those details. And so we can also customize such deliverables for companies that are interested. Next, please. And then there's our system, which I'm using for today's presentation. And the system is a web-based product. It's accessible by any type of computer, desktop or laptop, as well as tablets and smartphones. Here we have about, well, next please. On the system, we're looking at these 8 security threats: terrorism, piracy, insurgency and military operations, cargo theft, smuggling, stowaways, human trafficking, fraud and corruption, and activism. You can hear I'm speed reading to get to the subject matter. Next. So this is image, what you'll have on your screen when you're using our system. This is the global view. This is for the last 12 months, indicating all of the incidents that we've put on the system. Next. Getting closer to the subject now, here we have Southeast Asia, again with the icons showing the incidents that we've registered. Next. Now on the right, you'll see what each of those icons represents, from the worst case scenario of a hijacking at sea down to the more mild activities such as suspicious activity. Now, what you don't see here is incidents of vessels being approached, for example, by the Indonesian Navy because of unauthorized anchoring. However, as I said, we have these incidents. The other thing we have on the system are the threat assessments. Next. So here you have the threat assessment for Indonesia. You'll find threat assessments for countries, areas, as well as ports, depending on what level of detail you want. Now, for the country of Indonesia, for this slide, I have put the relevant text describing these enforcement in terms of unauthorized anchorage. And in that, next. Yes, here's zooming into that specific paragraph. And you'll see that what we cover in that summary is basically, what Ashok said. Vessels operating in the area should be aware of these incidents. Something that's part of, I think, what you might call BIMCO's mantra: be wary of ambiguous terminology. For example, it's commonly considered that it's all right to anchor in the Singapore outer port limits, or sometimes called OPL. But some of these areas are not recognized legally, and I think Dughall might be able to talk more about that, as Singapore outer port limits. It might be a contentious term, which could lead you into trouble. And some of those areas that are considered Singapore outer port limits are actually in Indonesian waters or Malaysian waters. So be careful when you're faced with some agreements that are using such terminology. Now, we've seen in 2020, enforcement initiatives have resulted with many vessels being forced out of these unauthorized anchorage areas. Some have been facing detention, and others have been fined. And to wrap that up, one of the things we found from looking at P&I circulars, some of those circulars were actually based upon advice from Spica, is that one way to reduce the risk of this happening is to prearrange your anchoring operation with the closest port agent to make sure that you've got some form of approval before you drop the anchor. Next. Now here, I also want to illustrate it's not just Indonesia that doesn't take kindly to unauthorized anchorage. Last year, the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore issued this circular. And just to underline how unwelcome it is to do this in Singaporean territorial waters, the initial fine will be $15,000 US, and for every day that you remain in that position, it will be $1,500 additional per day. Next. And to make it more current, this article describes an incident in which a vessel was approached by the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency for, again, unauthorized anchorage off of the eastern coast of the Johor Peninsula. And we don't know what the punishment was, but it could be a fine of between $5,000 to $24,000 US. And there's also the potential for detention or other delays. So with that, I think I've brought us as close to real time as I could. Ashok?
Sorry about that. Yes, thanks a lot, Thomas. I think that was quite quick. You went quickly through your slides. We will now move on to the panel discussion, and Dughall, the first question that I have for you is, there have been differing claims of these boundaries between the countries, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And in fact, there is, as of now, one conflicting claim of a certain part of maritime boundary between Singapore and Malaysia. Now, for ship owners, apart from avoiding these areas of conflicting claims by a wide margin, can merchant ships resort to other measures to ensure they do not get involved in the legal tangle?
Sure, thanks, Ashok. Perhaps a little bit of history would be helpful for everybody at this stage. As I sit here in my office in Singapore, the Singapore Strait is right outside my window, and I can see Indonesia. And Malaysia is only a short, depending on which way you go, maybe 20-mile journey. These are tight waters, and so historically it's just simply not been possible for any of the littoral states to claim territorial waters of 12 miles. And as a result of that, there was an acceptance over time that port limits of 3 miles or the median line in the Johor Strait would be used by the states to determine who had responsibility. What that resulted in was a couple of areas specifically that were referred to for decades as international waters in the Singapore Straits. One of these western approaches Singapore between the area of Tanjung Piai in Malaysia and Tuas West in Singapore, off the new megaport at Tuas now, and then also out to the east of Singapore, historically what was called Singapore OPL East. There was a slim area between the northern boundary of the traffic separation scheme and Johor port limits. And that was fine, and that worked relatively well right up until 2005, when the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency, the MMEA, was set up, and the MMEA started exerting control over territorial waters. Even where that simply wasn't possible, they would use territorial waters as their guiding line. And what that meant was that Singapore would claim port limits, for example, 3 miles, and then Malaysia would claim everything else. So essentially, we went from a situation where you could anchor at ease in certain areas within the Singapore Strait and not have to worry about being molested by anybody, to a situation where overnight and unannounced, literally there is now nowhere in the Singapore Strait which is unclaimed by one of the littoral straits. What this led to since 2005 is a migration further and further east, and essentially out of the eastern end of the Singapore Strait, past Horsburgh Light, which will be famous to anybody who's been at sea, and into the bottom end of the South China Sea. That area, which is now well over 25 miles from Singapore, is now referred to as Singapore OPL East, and was widely believed to be international waters. However, in a reaction to the increasing volume of vessels that were anchoring in that area, both the Malaysians and the Indonesians have further expanded their territorial ambitions to now cover this area also.
Sure, but many a times ships are operating very close to these boundaries, and at times they're not sure in whose territories they are. What precautions should they take in such instances?
Sure. I mean, historically, we would just say to people from a precautionary stance, just make sure that you are more than 12 nautical miles off the nearest coastline. And for a very, very long time, that was more than adequate. Even that, however, now is no longer safe. If you go back to 2008, when Singapore and Malaysia, respectively, were recognized as having jurisdiction over Horsburgh Light and Pedra Branca, the island on which Horsburgh Light stands, and South Ledge and Middle Rocks for Malaysia. You now have Singapore and Malaysia have areas of land out there around which theoretically they might claim 12 nautical miles. You also have, and this is a very recent development, the Malaysian authorities have built recently a new beacon, the Tompok Utara beacon, and that is about 8 nautical miles off the Malaysian coast. In fact, it's closer to Pedra Branca, to a bit of Singapore, than it is to the Malaysian coastline. But around there, the Malaysian authorities are now claiming 12 nautical miles around a beacon. So essentially that means if you draw a straight line from the Malaysian coast through the Utara beacon and keep going east, they're now claiming 20 miles as territorial waters. So the old advice, just make sure you're not 12 nautical miles, is no longer safe. As an interesting illustration of that, the last article that Thomas put up in his slide made reference to the Director Maritime of the MMEA talking about detaining a vessel from Ulaanbaatar because she was 14.2 miles off the Malaysian coast. So there is illustration for you if you needed it, what is going on. As to precautions, Ashok, the simplest one is to clear into port. And if you clear into port, you will obviously be afforded the protections of that port. I clearly recognise, however, that commercial considerations dictate often a preference not to do that, and people will seek an anchorage in international waters. It is far, far safer for a ship owner to assume when they are in the waters that we are talking about here that they are in someone's waters, and therefore to try and make sure that they are not anchoring in someone's waters, it would be best to seek, and Thomas made reference to this, advice from a ship's agent in not one, I think as Thomas referred to, but in multiple jurisdictions, just to ensure that they are anchoring out with the jurisdiction of the surrounding countries. Another caution I might just add, if I may, sitting where we sit, we've probably handled well in excess of 100 detentions of this nature in and around the Singapore Straits in the last decade. And a common situation we see arising is if a ship owner is going to Eastern OPL Singapore, so out with Horsburgh Light, let's say to debunker, which happens occasionally, or to undertake repairs or to do tank cleaning or whatever it happens to be, do not assume that the position provided you by the contractor that you are using is safe for you. It may be for them, but that does not mean it's the same for you.
Thanks, Dughall. I think it's quite clear that you clear in the port or the country and ask agents rather than just any contractor. Thomas, a question for you. There has been an increase in the piracy activities in this area. Many times authorities insist ships to anchor within a designated anchorage area. Now, is there any security angle to this particular requirement?
Well, yeah, I think you touched on two things there. One, we have to be careful about the reports going around, the headlines, the clickbait that say there's been a jump in piracy. In fact, the BBC had such a headline and tried to link it to coronavirus. And this was based on comparing, I believe, the statistics in August of this year with the statistics of August last year. And here you're talking about a small number of incidents for one particular month, not looking at the incidents from January to present time. So you can get different conclusions based on what statistics or what numbers you're actually comparing. So just to close that part off, actually for 2020, there were more incidents in the Straits of Malacca and Singapore before the coronavirus started taking a toll, before the shutdowns. And here in Singapore, Dughall and I are enjoying phase 2 and awaiting phase 3, which started out with a circuit breaker. But if you look at the numbers for 2020, actually, as we were locked down, the numbers actually went down. There were more incidents before that. In terms of the designated so-called secure anchorage, this was an initiative which the Indonesians established, and it does have an advantage because there's a dedicated patrol. Now, granted, the enthusiasm of the authorities conducting the patrols varies depending on which area you're looking at. Some are more effective than others. But for one thing, you know you're in an authorized place. And the second thing, you have a possibility of being better protected from people boarding the vessel for theft or armed robbery. So one of the things that has come up, and I believe it was the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency that identified this, is when they're finding vessels that are outside of authorized anchorage areas. If there should be a security incident, it's more difficult for them to have a rapid response. So for all of the above, it's good to ensure, A, that you're in an authorized anchorage area so you get a faster response, you avoid the fines and penalties and delays that we've talked about, and overall, you'll just be reducing the risks of encountering these problems.
Super, thanks a lot, Thomas. I think that makes quite good sense that if you do need assistance on a security angle, I think you would be best placed if you are in a designated area, because that's where the naval ships can come and assist you quickly. In your slides, as you went through, there was a list of 8 threats, and I just quickly read through them, and one of them was insurgency and military operations. Would you give us a sort of a description of that?
Yes, in the region, there's a number of groups. I suppose at the moment, the most well-known one is the Abu Sayyaf group in the Philippines that for a while was kidnapping seafarers from cargo ships. More recently, they've been suppressed and at the moment appear only to be able to kidnap fishermen from trawlers. Their goal was to establish a caliphate or an autonomous state in the southern Philippines. So by definition, that would be an insurgency for that purpose. But there are others that are less well known. Staying with the Philippines a moment, there's the New People's Army, which is an insurgency of communists seeking to overthrow the legitimate government. Fortunately, this has no impact on maritime operations. They're focused more on attacking industrial facilities, police stations. They have gone after the Coast Guard, but again, that's on a merchant installation. It was a Coast Guard pier. Other parts of the region, I think because of time, because actually I'm going to be doing a similar webinar later this month on such groups. So if you want to know more about that, tune in for that. But just to close that question off, one that does have an impact on maritime operations is in Myanmar. However, that group has in the past only targeted river transport. So you really you're almost grasping at straws to find an insurgency group that's going to involve our respective members and clients' operations. So yeah, insurgency and military operations doesn't have a big impact, except I think I can also bring in military operations. Dughall has mentioned that the disagreements between Malaysia and Singapore, particularly in the western part of the Singapore Strait, the port boundary of Tuas and Tanjung Pelepas, resulted with both countries sending their respective navies to intensify patrols in that area. So we've seen this in other parts of the world. When you have a concentration of gray hulls, this can have a positive effect on suppressing maritime crimes. So for a while, there was actually a decrease while that conflict was at it, or not conflict, but disagreement was at its peak. There was actually a decrease in armed robberies and thefts involving vessels in that part of the Singapore Strait on the boundary to the Malacca Strait. So sometimes these conflicts, while politically they have some concerns, for maritime operations, they have some benefits.
Thank you for that, Thomas. Now, before I go on to ask my next question to Dughall, I wish to tell our audience that if you have any questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat box, and we will take them soon as we move to the Q&A session. Dughall, my next question to you is, quite a few of merchant ships use these waters as waiting grounds awaiting their next voyage, and they're not necessarily waiting in designated anchorages all the time. What sort of advice would you give to those ships?
Really, just Ashok, as we said before, you know, I mentioned commercial realities dictating that it's not always preferable for ships to come into port whilst they're awaiting orders. So we all recognise that commercially ships are going to await orders in international waters. But there's a huge amount of information available to a ship owner, whether it be BIMCO, whether it be their P&I club, whether it be a local ships agent, whether it be a local correspondent such as myself, you know, in the various ports. And really, as I said earlier, seek, particularly in the waters that we're talking about to the east of Horsburgh Light, the bottom end of the South China Sea, take advice, it costs nothing, from individuals in Indonesia, in Singapore and Malaysia to be sure that the position that either you are proposing or somebody is proposing to you is safe and clear from anybody's likely boundary. Really, that's all I would say, is just seek advice from multiple sources to make sure you're in a safe spot.
Super, thanks a lot. Thomas, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's very sound advice. I mean, situational awareness is one of the best ways to protect yourself from getting into trouble, whether it's with the pirates or with the authorities and so on. So I would only say I completely agree.
Great. Dughall, then we just move on to this particular problem in Indonesia, and we have seen some heightened level of enforcement activities, especially starting from the year 2019. Now, we know that Indonesian law exists for quite some time, at least as far as I know from 2008, but the enforcement activities started off early 2019, and then it's sort of moved on from there. Why is this now? Would you shed some light on this?
Well, despite my very sound advice to make sure you seek advice from all sorts of parties, sometimes even when you do that, you know, you're going to fall foul. The reality is there's all sorts of evidences of the current Indonesian government's desire to improve, or shall we say, protect Indonesia's maritime sovereignty. And protecting Indonesia's waters is just one of those. So looking at the history of the situation that we found ourselves in the Straits, and I touched earlier on the move east of ships seeking safe anchorage whilst awaiting orders, the Indonesian authorities found themselves with this area to the east of Horsburgh Light being ever increasingly busy with ships anchored. And as I say, as far as efforts to improve their maritime sovereignty, they drew a straight line from Tanjung Berakit on the northeastern coast of Pulau Bintan, which forms the southern boundary of the Singapore Strait, and anything that fell within 12 nautical miles of Indonesia. The Indonesians thought, well, you know what, if it's good for Singapore and it's good for Malaysia, it's good for us too. And on that fateful day in January of 2019, the Indonesian Navy went out to something in the region of 25 vessels that were anchored there and told them to move. Now, they didn't all move. Some moved and came back exactly to where they were before, and the Navy repeated the caution. And when the ships either refused to move or did and then came back, they were detained by the Indonesian Navy. Sometimes, unfortunately, you know, the goalposts are shifted, and you know, there's just no announcement as to that. And that first tranche of ships that got caught, you know, unfortunately, realistically, other than taking the advice of staying more than 12 nautical miles away from anybody's coastline, you know, there's not really much they could have done because nobody would have seen it coming.
Yep, thanks, Dughall. Yes, you're right there. Thomas, there are certain illegal activities that happen in these waters, and I think the authorities are really after those activities. Do you want to shed some light on this, and what should merchant ships do to sort of avoid getting into a legal tangle with the enforcement authorities? Right.
The first incident that comes to mind was not too long ago. There was a tanker over a 24-hour period going back and forth on the Singapore Strait, switching its AIS on and off. So for much of the time, you wouldn't be able to track what the location was and what she was doing. But at the end of the day, the Indonesian Navy decided to intervene, approached the tanker, and gave chase. It was a hot pursuit, and the tanker ended up in Singapore waters off of Changi Navy base, and stayed there for quite some time. So the suspicion is, of course, either there's illegal fuel sales or illegal fuel storage of some kind going on. The good news is that unlike in 2017, when tankers were targeted and hijacked because the persons behind the illegal fuel sales wanted to top up their supply, so what better way than to take it from a nearby tanker? That came to an end in 2017, and now it seems to be tankers that have gotten their hands on subsidized fuel, perhaps through corruption at various terminals where they could pay someone to provide some supply, and then operate South China Sea and Singapore Strait to customers that want to buy it. And the good news there is everybody involved in those transactions knows what they're involved with. So to get to the point of your question, for ship operators who do not want to be caught involved with illegal activity, purchase your bunkers from licensed bunker operators and so forth, and don't try to save some costs by purchasing your fuel on the black market. I think that, I mean, in the time that we have today, I think that's the key point I would bring up on that question.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I think that's quite a wise advice. There are also offshore ships. Sorry, Dughall, you have something to add there?
Yeah, I just jump in on that, Ashok. Thomas is absolutely right. And, you know, this is the thing that the Singaporean authorities is very hot on. You know, if you either debunker or U-bunker from a vessel outside of kind of any recognizable port, you have fallen amongst thieves. There's no two ways around that. It is time without number. Owners have come to us and they've either received bad bunkers or they get into some form of dispute with somebody who's debunkering their vessel, and they come to us in Singapore and they seek our assistance, or the assistance of the port, and I advise them, you are 25 nautical miles away from Singapore. Singapore has a very robust rule of law. It has a very robust licensing arrangement for bunker tankers, even within port. Who can go alongside and deliver bunkers, who can do it in the anchorage. And if you are not using a licensed bunker contractor, then you get exactly what you deserve. And the other thing to bear in mind about that is, again, if you are using an unlicensed bunkering supplier outside port limits to debunker bad bunkers, you have to recognize the fact that those bad bunkers, where do you think they go? You know, it is a positive feedback loop, and they go straight back on the next vessel that happens down the straits who's looking for a cheap deal. And so it continues. Singapore's done a huge amount of work to make sure this doesn't happen, and doesn't happen as much as it used to. But if I think back to the 90s, every day of the week we would have a vessel, you know, caught in that cycle. So Thomas is entirely correct. If you bunker or debunker outside port limits, you get what you deserve.
Super. Thanks, Dughall. Thomas, I was just mentioning about the offshore vessels that operate here. There's quite a few of them. Would you give the same advice to them, or is there anything specific that they should keep in mind?
Oh, absolutely. Same advice. I mean, across the board, anybody who's looking for fuel, as Dughall said, make sure you're purchasing it or debunkering from a licensed operator. But for the offshore vessels, we've seen OSVs get into trouble. However, in that context, it's primarily been when they're alongside even berth at some of the ports of Batam, where armed robbers or armed persons have come on board. Things have gotten violent down there. So just good seamanship, keep a good deck watch, illuminate your vessel, whether you're alongside or at anchorage, and in Singapore Strait underway as well. This is one of the areas where I have seen the offshore vessels come up. I have not seen platforms, for example, boarded. That has not been a problem in Southeast Asia. But the support craft, they do have to conduct good seamanship and be aware of the precautions that are available to them.
Thanks, Thomas. And I think that's also why we have this advice or support circulars from Singapore, Malaysia, and also Indonesia to keep the AIS on at all times to ensure that the good guys are not caught out doing a bad deal. Well, thanks for that. we're quickly moving to the end of our time. I don't see any questions. I will simply move to the next question from my own list. Either we're doing quite good with the questions, or users or our audience are still waiting for our questions. Dughall, very quickly, even after doing all these, taking all these precautions and the advice and having agents set up in different countries, what if you are still boarded or intercepted and boarded by any authority for that matter? What should a prudent master do, or a ship owner do in that case?
Well, the first thing and the simple thing they should do, assuming the detention is lawful, and if it's the MMEA in Malaysia, they've got a big white boat with red stripes on the side like the US Coast Guard. And if it's Indonesia, it's a big grey boat with guns. It's pretty obvious whether or not the detention is lawful or not. If it is, comply is the simplest thing to do. There are plenty of examples we have of masters, ship owners refusing to comply, and these universally end badly. These are sovereign nations that we are talking about. And their laws allow them to come on board your vessel and detain you if they believe you have it anchored illegally. When the Indonesian gunboat or the MMEA boat is alongside, that is not the time to be arguing whether you think you're in international waters or not. You're wasting your breath and their time. In both of those situations, Ashok, what normally happens is the ship's documents and two members of crew, a deck officer and an engineer usually, are taken ashore. It does a number of things. One, it starts the process of taking statements, but two, it secures the vessel to the location. And realistically, you just have to comply with that. At that juncture, you need to be appointing advising your P&I club of its occurrence, or your local P&I correspondent, who will be well versed with what will happen next. The P&I club won't necessarily be involved, depending on the nature of the detention, but they will certainly, in all circumstances, provide the necessary advice and information and recommendations as to parties that the ship owners might seek immediate advice from as to what is going to happen next.
Yeah, and there have been claims that some of these ships are kept detained for not just days but weeks, and some even to a few months. Why is there a delay in this process? And sometimes it feels like the whole process is not transparent. Why is this?
Sure. Well, again, it depends where it happens. In Malaysia, a detention via the MMEA, it's pretty clear what's going to happen next. There is a very well-trodden route that the MMEA will go down, involving the Marine Department, Hydrography Department, to confirm the vessel was inside Malaysian waters. And then the MMEA's proposal for prosecution will be put to the courts in Malaysia, and you go through the process. That process takes something in the region of 4 to 6 weeks to conclude. There is no shortcutting it. That is how long it's going to take. The good news, and there's little good news here, but the good news for an owner is it's a very clearly prescribed route to the solution. If, however, it happens in Indonesia, the clarity of the route to solution is not there. And going back to the situation that we encountered at the beginning of 2019, part of the problem was it was unclear even to those who had detained the vessels as to what the release protocol was going to be. And what that meant was, at that time, and it's improved slightly, but what it meant was that there were going to be extremely lengthy, protracted and expensive legal processes that would need to be gone through in Indonesia. This took many, many, many months to achieve in 2019. And the reality is, even in 2020, the threat of 4, 6, 8 months worth of legal process to try and secure the release of your vessel is a very, very real one. And that is part of the way it works, shall we say. to encourage ship owners to get on with trying to release their vessel as quickly as they possibly can. In the very worst circumstances, those detentions have been approaching a year, and therefore the losses that are incurred by a ship owner are just staggering. And sometimes they get so great that their war risk underwriters get involved by way of a CTL because of the length of the detention. Unfortunately, the situation, whilst it has improved slightly because now we are the route to conclusion is clearer, and so it's easier for us to say to a ship owner, okay, this is what you need to do. The trouble comes when a ship owner says, okay, how long is that going to take? And the unfortunate reality of it in Indonesia, the law just does not move as quickly in Indonesia as it does in Malaysia and Singapore, and there is no recognition of the commercial value of the vessel and the losses being incurred by the courts. It will take many months to get your ship back.
Thanks a lot, Dughall. And it sounds quite complicated, especially in Indonesia, and that is why ships have got to avoid these areas as much as they can if they're not intending to enter it or do any operations, but also comply with the authorities, like you mentioned, to sort of smoothen the process. We are actually about 7 minutes over time, and I don't see any questions. I can only assume we've done very well in covering the topic. Do you have any last words, Thomas or Dughall, on this topic?
Well, I would only mention that I guess one of the takeaways is not just avoid the area, but avoid entangling yourself unnecessarily with the authorities by doing your due diligence, making sure you drop your anchor in an authorized area, and stay away from unlicensed bunker suppliers.
Yeah, Ashok, look, just to repeat, be very, very cautious before anchoring in these areas, and seek advice before you do so from as many experienced parties as it is practical to do before you drop your stick.
Thank you very much. I cannot see any chat. Jesper, can you see anything on your side? Just hope that it's not my screen that's frozen. All right, great then. Thank you both, Thomas and Dughall, for joining us this afternoon. And to our audience, have a great day ahead, and we will see you soon in the next BIMCO webinar.